Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk. So let's talk. I apologize for the delay in the reading of this book. I ended up going home. We had a tornado. I got sick with the flu, and I stayed home a little bit extra this round. So I am a little behind on this book. I had actually narrated it once, and something happened with the footage, so I'm doing this over. We're going to try to get to chapter 3, 4, and 5, and if possible, a little further. Thank you so much for being a part of the Let's Talk family. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. And also be sure to click that bell that gives you the notifications for every time that I upload a video, and it will help you to find me. Also, please do share, comment, and like this video. It helps me with the algorithm, and I hope that you are considering sending me in your testimony via email or snail mail, and those addresses will be in the description box below or on the screen right here. But I want to delve right into the book and get going on chapter 3. Nikolai awoke with a start as he felt the engineer apply the air brakes to the line of train cars. The sun was not yet up, but streaks of magenta were creasing the horizon as Nikolai stared deeply out the train car windows. Just a few hours before, the gentle swaying of the tray had lulled him into a fitful sleep. Handcuffed to the seat, he had found it difficult to stretch out in a comfortable position. He sat up stiffly and noticed that most of the other passengers were still sleeping. Some were stretched out on the upper bunks, some across the lower seats, as he was, while still others were sprawled in the aisles on the floor. The previous afternoon, 2 army soldiers had boarded the train with Nikolai and 2 other prisoners and set out for the city of Omsk. They knew little as to the details of their journey, except that they would eventually end up at the Siberian prison camp. Nikolai tried to remain positive in spite of his uncomfortable surroundings, which included being handcuffed at all times, except for when he needed to use the bathroom, and even then, a guard stood out the door. It wasn't much, but Nikolai was grateful for the small bag of bread and a can of water that the prisoners received each day. The rations were meager, but as the train chugged eastward along the tracks, Nikolai's mind kept returning to a familiar verse in Scripture. Even your bread and water shall be sure. The words to the text comforted him when he thought about the literal fulfillment of that promise. The trip was tedious, but Nikolai knew that even on this train he should be ready to speak for God and witness for his faith. Somewhere during the first morning on the train, Nikolai struck up a conversation with a middle-aged man sitting next to him. The man's face looked drawn and tired even after a night's rest. When Nikolai expressed care and concern, the man introduced himself as Yuri and said that he was returning to his home from the small town of Krasnodon. He worked in the city of Kharkov, but his wife and children lived in Krasnodon. Tending to the gardens at the family dacha, it was difficult for the family to be apart all the time, but like most families in the Ukraine, it was the only way they could make ends meet financially. Yuri had recently received a letter from his home telling him his wife was sick and that he'd better catch the next train to Krasnodon. She has bleeding spells, usually from the nose, Yuri confided. The doctors have done all they can, but it's not a good situation. One time last year she bled so much that she had to stay in bed for more than a week until she could get her strength back. He paused and then continued. Her condition is serious again, but we don't know what's causing the bleeding or how to stop it. I'm afraid I'm going to lose her, and it scares me more than anything I've ever had to face in my life. The man's voice grew somber. It frightens her too, he added. and Nikolai could see the fear clearly written on his face. Death is a dark place. No one knows what happens to a person when they die. Nikolai listened to the man and saw the desperate need in his eyes. He could tell this man was in need of comfort. If Nikolai could give him even one ray of hope, he knew it would help. And so, Nikolai began to tell him stories about Jesus and the healing power that God can bring to a life. He explained to Yuri that he didn't need to worry about death because the Creator of life had conquered death. Jesus, God's Son, he had died for the sins of the world and then rose again from the dead. He is in heaven now and has the power to give the gift of eternal life to all who will accept it. Are you a priest? Yuri suddenly asked. You speak of God as though you know him well, and you speak the future as though if you've already seen it. Nikolai smiled warmly. I'm a pastor, he admitted, and I love God very much. As for the future, I've had a wonderful book that tells me what to expect so that I can be ready for it when it comes. I wish it were possible for you to come to my village, Yuri said. My wife would be so happy to meet you, I'm sure. Maybe you could even help her with her illness. It was then that Nikolai shared with Yuri and the other passengers why he was on the train as a prisoner. He spoke about his churches and how much everyone loved Jesus. He spoke of his refusal to give the KGB the names of all his members. No one said anything as Nikolai told his story. By the looks of their faces, he could tell that many of the passengers sympathized with him in his plight and the injustice of the sentence. Of course, no one dared express their true feelings for the fear that they might be accused of being sympathizers and end up being sent to prison camp as Nikolai was. Yuri bowed his head dejectedly when he understood that Nikolai was not going to be able to go to his house and pray for his wife as he wished. However, what he said next surprised even Nikolai. Would you be willing to pray for my wife right now? He asked. Tears came from Nikolai's eyes as he witnessed the measure of faith Yuri had gained in the few minutes they had been talking. The train car grew silent as Nikolai bowed his head and prayed for Yuri's sick wife and his children. It seemed that heaven had drawn very close, and the Spirit of God was hovering near. When Nikolai finished praying, he noticed that a solemn look had come over the faces of many passengers on board. It was as if they understood the pain Yuri must be going through, but it also appeared as though Nikolai's prayer had touched them personally too. When the train approached Krasnodar later that afternoon, Yuri thanked Nikolai for the prayer he had offered for his wife and family, and he expressed disappointment that he could never see Nikolai again. Take heart, Nikolai challenged Yuri. We will meet each other again in heaven one day. At this announcement, several other of the passengers began to listen again, and some even came close and sat close to him where Nikolai and Yuri were talking. Because Jesus loves you so much, he left us some very special words. He doesn't want us to be discouraged while we wait for him to come and take us away to home and go home with him. Let not your heart be troubled, Nikolai began. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. John 14:1-3, New King James Version. As the train pulled into the station, Nikolai prayed again for Yuri's wife and children, and then for each person in that small circle on the train. Again, Nikolai called upon the master physician to do for Yuri's wife what the doctors could not do. And again, he sensed the Holy Spirit drawing near. It was an awesome and inspiring experience. There were many tears when Nikolai finished his prayer, and many handshakes and hugs. It was as if Nikolai were a Christian apostle saying goodbye to his faithful members on one of his missionary trips around the world. Chapter 4. During the next days on the train, Nikolai brought many more people to God. Several gave their hearts to Jesus and became Christians. Nikolai could not baptize them, but he encouraged them to find an Adventist pastor and asked that this be done for them. After the train had begun traveling eastward for several days, it finally neared the city of Omsk. Nikolai had heard that the prisoners would be transferred to another train when they arrived in Omsk. But it was as much information as he could get. No one had told him yet how far they had to go or how long it was going to take for the entire trip. Judging by the speed of the slowly moving train, Nikolai was guessing the trip would span at least 10 days. Near sunset of the 6th day, the train arrived in Omsk, a city known for its industry and oil production. Within the hour, Nikolai and the other prisoners were transferred to a train headed north. By dark, the train was lumbering across the plains, and Nikolai had settled in again for the remainder of the trip. There were almost no passengers on this leg of the journey, because they were now riding on a freight train. In fact, other than the 3 prisoners and the 2 soldiers guarding them, the only riders were the engineer, his furnace stoker, and half a dozen other workers who took up their positions near the end of the train. Nikolai and his 2 fellow prisoners were confined in a mail car. Heavy manacles were now attached to their legs, as well as their wrists, so they wouldn't be able to escape. Nikolai smiled to himself as he stared out the window of the mail car and watched the landscape pass slowly by. Even if he could escape in these wastelands, where would he go? As the train wound its way northward, the country became even more flat and littered with swampy muskegs. By now, there were no trees in the desolate terrain. For 3 long days, the train crawled northward across mosquito-infested tundras and around small boggy lakes. But only once or twice did Nikolai see even a small village. He did catch a glimpse of a reindeer herd, and now and then a few hunters following the herds. Nikolai wondered what it would be like to be on the open tundra. Would he be free to come and go as he pleased as at the prison? Or would he be locked up for most of the time? It was at these moments that Nikolai found himself wondering about the decisions he had made during the past few weeks. But then he remembered his commission. He was a pastor for God and an evangelist to the world. If God needed him in Kiev, then that's where he would be to preach for God. If God wanted him on a train bringing hope to the light of salvation to those who were discouraged, then that was his assignment. And if God wanted him to be in the prison camp in Siberia, then Siberia it was. The kind of attitude bolstered Nikolai's faith and gave him courage to face whatever his imagination told him might be coming. Somewhere in the morning hours of the 3rd day, the engineer applied the brakes. As Nikolai stirred the train slowly and came to a complete stop, the sun hadn't come up yet, but the dusk of the northern twilight sky, Nikolai could see the landscape clearly. There was no train station, no village, and not even a sod hut or a horse corral. In the glow of the moonlight, it was obvious there was nothing but the mosses, liches, and scrubby tundra, grasses of western Siberia. The landscape looked to be as desolate as any he had ever seen. The air was damp and cool. The month of June had come, and with it longer days of the North Country. In fact, they were so far north it really never got dark at night. This time of the year, the sun set around 11 in the evening, dipping below the northern horizons, and when it came up again, around 3:30 in the morning. The prisoners climbed out of the train, and with them 2 soldiers guarding them. The soldiers pulled a half a dozen packs from the small mail car and gave them the prisoners to carry. As the train pulled away and it disappeared to the north, all the manacles and handcuffs were removed from the prisoners. Escaping was pointless. They were thousands of kilometers from their home and hundreds of kilometers from the nearest train station or remote village. Andrei, one of the prisoners, grew angry. "We have to walk?" he protested. "That's right." One of the guards waved his rifle in Andrei's face. "This is the end of the line for you. The rest of the way is on foot. And in case you haven't noticed," he snorted, "we guards are the ones who should be complaining, not you. We have to walk too, and we're not even criminals." Andrew scowled at the 2 soldiers. "Well, how far is it?" he grumbled. The soldier stepped forward impatiently. "If we make good time, we can get to the camp by late tonight. And if I were you," he growled, "I wouldn't be thinking about taking too many rest stops. The tundra wolves out here are pretty big. It's June, so they might not be that hungry, but we don't really want to take any chances. I've seen big ones take down a horse single-handedly. Now get going." The first guard pointed his gun eastward. "The prison camp is that way. March." And with that, the men walked off into the damp darkness. No flashlights, no torches, only the moon in the southern sky, the dim horizon in the north, and the stars still twinkling in the early morning sky. Chapter 5. The sun rose, and the men continued trudging across the Siberian landscape. The weather was pleasant enough, even with the sun shining down in its full strength. A slight breeze was blowing, but not enough to keep the mosquitoes, black flies, and the no-see-ums from swarming around them. Nikolai and the other men had not taken baths for some time, and this ended up being a natural bug repellent against the insects. The flies and mosquitoes found the smell of the sweat to be unpleasant and would alight for only a few seconds before moving on. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough of a deterrent for the no-see-ums. They were the worst. They were so tiny that it was hard to see them, but they were there. They crawled into the men's eyes and ears and noses. They got into the men's hair and under the folds of their clothes. It seemed that no place was off limits to those pesky little insects. Eventually, Nikolai smeared swamp mud on his face, neck, and hands to keep the bugs from biting. When the other men saw what the mud had protected Nikolai, they followed his example. There was a faint trail across the tundra, which Nikolai felt must be the route to and from the prison camp. It wasn't an easy trail to walk, especially with all the bogs and muskigs everywhere. And skirting the spongy, swampy ground was tiring. Not a soul appeared to be anywhere in the vicinity. As the day wore on without a sign of human life, the strangest sort of panic began to creep over Nikolai. He felt as if he were walking to the edge of the Earth's last wilderness, where absolutely solitude existed. Surely human life could not exist in such a godforsaken place. But then he remembered his resolve and his mission. Wherever he was headed, God needed him there. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world, and to all nations, and then shall the end shall come. Matthew 24:14. Those words from one of Nicolaus' favorite passages in scriptures, and they reminded him of his commitment to God. The idea calmed him a bit, and after a while he was able to regain his composure. The men walked on long into the evening, but since the sun set so late this time of year, the way was clearly lit. And then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Nikolai caught a sight of some buildings in the distance. The men all quickened their pace. They had come so far after 11 days of bread and water and handcuffs, their journey was finally over. As they drew near the prison camp, and the Arctic summer twilight settled in with its deepening shadows, it was still light enough for Nikolai to take stock of the place. It appeared that the camp had a kitchen and a mess hall, and of course barracks for the prisoners to live in. There were other barns and sheds too, and a huge garden, maybe a 2.5 acre in size, and sitting prominently in the middle of the camp was a building that looked like some kind of administrative headquarters. But the thing that surprised Nikolai the most was the building materials. Most of the buildings were not made of wood. They were made of tundra sod. He had heard of such places where the soil, it was grassy roots, was cut out of the ground into blocks and stacked like bricks to make walls, but Nikolai had never actually seen it with his own eyes. Most of the buildings were made of sod, except the kitchen and administrative headquarters. What lumber was used in the camp must have been brought in by horse and wagon. There was no other way to get it here, Nikolai figured. The building construction was quite simple, with tall stovepipes sticking through steep corrugated metal roofs, designed to shed the heavy Siberian snow. Small doors and very few windows kept the openings in the building to a minimum. There was no doubt that this had helped conserve the heat Nikolai knew they would need it in long cold winters ahead. In front of the building that looked like an administrative headquarters, a Soviet Union flag with a sickle and hammer stitched on it flapped gently in the breeze. Nikolai sensed that even in this far-flung region, prisoners and guards alike had a sense of patriotism and national pride. As the party of 5 arrived in the camp, they caused quite a stir. The hour was late, but even so, prisoners and guards alike began to pour out of the barracks and other buildings. It was obvious that most of them had been roused from sleep, but it didn't seem to matter. This was the first contact anyone had had with the outside world in months. Everyone gathered around, curious to get a good look at the new prisoners. The soldiers had brought mail for the officers and guards on duty, and there were even a few select pieces from some of the prisoners. But mostly the inmates were just glad to see new faces and hear the latest news. When all the excitement had died down, the prison warden emerged in a nightshirt. He looked the prisoners over with bloodshot eyes. It looked as if he had been drinking, but Nikolai wasn't surprised. Even in this place, there had to be vodka. There was vodka everywhere in Russia. The people used to drink away their cares and troubles. They also used it for medical purposes, pouring it into cuts and wounds and infections. They even used it in their cars in the winter to keep the radiators and gas lines from freezing up. And surely the prison warden used it to drink away the loneliness of this place. As Nikolai studied the face of the officer, he wondered where this man's family was. Did he have a wife? Did he have children? He looked to be in his early 40s. Was he considered a military officer? The man looked as though he had let his appearance slide. But then again, Nikolai had no idea what the standard was for officers in outposts like this one. Did anyone really care how an officer looked? Nikolai guessed maybe not. In the glow of the twilight, Nikolai could see that the warden's face was of stubble already, and had heard start on the coming day. He had salt and pepper hair, and Nikolai had to smile. At least the man still had a full set of hair. Nikolai ran his hand over his own thinning scalp, reminding himself that he had less hair than the warden, though the warden looked to be older. The warden greeted the prisoners gruffly, and then turned to go back to his own headquarters. With a wave of his hand, he sent them with the guard on a short tour of the camp. Nikolai was surprised to discover that there were approximately 300 prisoners at the camp. The prison didn't appear to be big enough for those numbers, but judging by how the cramped bunks were in the barracks, he could believe it. Some of 20 to 30 prisoners were crowded into a tiny room, large enough maybe for 10 or 12. The only space Nikolai could tell or call his own was his own bunk, which was a little more than 5 foot in length. Rough-hewn boards formed the slats that made up each bunk and frame of the bed. Nikolai frowned as he looked around and stared up at the tin roof of the barracks. Like it or not, this was going to be his new home. The sooner he got used to it, the better off he'd be. We're going to conclude this today. Miracle of the Seventh-day Ox. I will be reading chapters 6, 7, and 8 possibly the next time. I was hoping to get a little more in, but the video is already going up on 30 minutes. And I do apologize for some of my stuttering or misreading. I'm still recovering from the flu. My mouth gets dry, and then I lose my place. So I do apologize for that. But I do hope that you continue on with me on this journey. And we will see you next time on Let's Talk for chapters 6, 7, and possibly 8. But we'll see then. Thank you for watching, subscribing, liking, and please be sure to click that bell. And also be sure to comment below. It helps my algorithm when you hit the like button. And please do send in your testimonies via the addresses in the description box below, which is my email address and my P.O.Box. And I would like to read your testimony online if you're willing to put it out there. Okay, we will see you next time on Let's Talk. We'll talk to you later. Bye.